Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we're exploring the horror that can exist just beyond your fence line, behind the next door, across the street. The people who live closest to us, who know our routines, who watch our daily lives. Sometimes they're hiding secrets that transform neighborhoods into nightmares. Tonight, 5 true stories about neighbors who crossed lines that should never be crossed, revealing that home isn't always the safest place to be. Story 1. The watcher next door. Jennifer Martinez thought she'd found the perfect neighborhood when she moved into 412 Maple Street. The suburban development was quiet, well-maintained, with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors who waved from their front porches. The 2-story colonial house was exactly what Jennifer had been looking for: affordable, move-in ready, and located in a safe area with good schools for her 7-year-old daughter. Emma. Jennifer had spent months searching for the right house after her divorce was finalized. As a single mother working as a registered nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, she needed a neighborhood that felt safe and secure, where Emma could play outside without constant supervision, and where Jennifer could feel confident leaving for 12-hour shifts knowing her daughter would be safe with the babysitter. The house next door, 414 Maple Street, was home to Walter Hensley, a retired accountant in his 60s who kept an immaculate lawn and seemed to take pride in maintaining his property. Walter's house was a mirror image of Jennifer's colonial, painted in complementary colors that suggested attention to neighborhood aesthetics and property values. When Jennifer first met Walter during her move-in day, he appeared helpful and neighborly, offering to let her use his garden hose when her water wasn't connected yet. Walter had emerged from his house within minutes of the moving truck's arrival, introducing himself with a firm handshake and warm smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Walter had said, his voice carrying the friendly authority of someone who had lived in the area for many years. "If you need anything at all, just knock on my door. I'm always home." Walter helped Jennifer's moving crew navigate the narrow driveway and offered practical advice about the neighborhood, which grocery stores were closest, where to find the best pizza delivery, which neighbors had children Emma's age. His assistance seemed genuine and appreciated, especially since Jennifer was managing the move without family support and could use all the help she could get. Jennifer appreciated having a considerate neighbor, especially as a single mother who worked full-time in a demanding profession. Her schedule at the hospital was unpredictable: 12-hour shifts that sometimes extended longer during emergencies, overtime requirements during staff shortages, and occasional calls to cover additional shifts when colleagues were sick. Having a stable, reliable neighbor like Walter felt like a blessing. Someone who was always home, who knew the neighborhood well, and who seemed genuinely interested in helping a new resident settle in successfully. For the first month, Walter seemed like the ideal neighbor. He collected Jennifer's mail when she worked late shifts, ensuring that important correspondence wouldn't accumulate visibly in her mailbox and advertise her absence to potential burglars. He helped carry groceries from her car when his hands were free, saving Jennifer time and energy after long shifts at the hospital. Walter always had a friendly wave when they encountered each other in their respective yards and seemed genuinely pleased to see Emma playing safely in the backyard. Walter's helpfulness extended to practical neighborhood knowledge that made Jennifer's transition smoother. He recommended reliable contractors when Jennifer needed minor repairs, suggested the best local businesses for household services, and provided insights about neighborhood events and community activities that Emma might enjoy. But gradually, Jennifer began to notice things that made her uncomfortable. Small observations that individually seemed innocent but collectively suggested a pattern of behavior that went beyond normal neighborly interest. Walter always seemed to be outside when Jennifer arrived home from work, regardless of what time her shift ended. Whether she came home at 8 p.m. after a day shift, 1 a.m. after an evening shift, or even 7 a.m. after working overnight, Walter would be in his yard, working in his garden, checking his mailbox, organizing tools in his garage, or simply standing on his front porch. Initially, Jennifer attributed this to coincidence or to Walter's retirement schedule, giving him flexibility to be outside whenever he wanted. Retired people often had irregular schedules and might naturally spend more time outdoors during pleasant weather. But as the pattern continued week after week, Jennifer began to wonder if Walter was deliberately timing his outdoor activities to coincide with her arrivals. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. Even when Jennifer's shift schedule changed unexpectedly due to hospital staffing needs, Walter would appear outside within minutes of her arrival home. This suggested that he was monitoring her schedule somehow or watching for her return from inside his house. Jennifer also noticed that Walter seemed unusually interested in her daily routine. During their conversations, he would ask detailed questions about her work schedule, about Emma's school activities, about her weekend plans. At first, these seemed like normal neighborly conversations, the kind of friendly interest that neighbors naturally take in each other's lives. But Walter's questions became increasingly specific and personal. He wanted to know exactly which days Jennifer worked, what time her shift started and ended, whether she ever worked overtime or picked up extra shifts. He asked about Emma's after-school activities, playdates, and sleepover arrangements with a level of detail that seemed beyond casual interest. "I noticed Emma had a sleepover on Saturday," Walter mentioned during one conversation. His tone casual, but his attention focused intently on Jennifer's response. "Did the girls have fun? I heard them laughing pretty late into the evening." Jennifer was surprised that Walter had been monitoring her daughter's activities so closely. Emma's friend Madison had spent the night, and they had been playing in Emma's bedroom, which faced the back of the house, not visible from Walter's property under normal circumstances. Emma's bedroom was on the second floor at the rear of the house, with windows that looked out over Jennifer's backyard and the privacy fence that separated their property from the neighbors behind them. For Walter to know about the sleepover, he would have had to be specifically watching or listening for activity in areas of Jennifer's house that weren't visible from his normal vantage points. "How did you know about the sleepover?" Jennifer asked, keeping her tone light but feeling genuinely curious about how Walter had obtained this information. Walter looked momentarily uncomfortable, his confident demeanor faltering slightly as he realized that his knowledge might seem intrusive. "Oh, I just happened to hear voices when I was working in my backyard. Sound carries, you know. Young voices are particularly clear in the evening." But Jennifer knew that her backyard was separated from Walter's by a 6-foot privacy fence made of solid wood panels that should have blocked both visual and audio surveillance of her property. Emma's bedroom was on the second floor, with windows that would be even less accessible to casual observation from ground level. For Walter to have heard conversations from inside Emma's bedroom, he would have had to be deliberately positioning himself to listen, possibly using equipment to amplify sound, or finding ways to get closer to Jennifer's house than normal property boundaries would allow. The incident that truly alarmed Jennifer occurred on a Thursday evening in October. Jennifer was working a late shift at the hospital, covering for a colleague who had called in sick. Her shift was scheduled to end at 11 p.m., but a multi-vehicle accident brought several trauma patients to the emergency department, extending Jennifer's work until nearly midnight. Emma was staying overnight with Jennifer's sister Rebecca, who lived across town and often provided childcare when Jennifer's work schedule required overnight coverage. The house should have been completely empty from the time Jennifer left for work at 2 p.m. until she returned after midnight, when Jennifer arrived home at 12:30 a.m. She immediately noticed that the light in Emma's bedroom was on. The warm yellow glow was clearly visible through the second-floor window, creating a rectangle of brightness against the dark facade of the house. Jennifer was certain she had turned off all lights before leaving for work. Her routine always included a final walkthrough of the house to ensure that lights were off, doors were locked, and all appliances were safely secured. She was particularly careful about Emma's room because the overhead light had a tendency to stay on if the wall switch wasn't pushed firmly into the off position. Jennifer checked the house thoroughly, entering through the front door and systematically examining each room. All doors and windows were locked exactly as she had left them. The security system showed no record of any doors or windows being opened during her absence. There were no obvious signs of forced entry or disturbance. Asterisk, but Emma's bedroom showed subtle signs that someone had been inside. The stuffed animals on Emma's bed, which Jennifer had arranged neatly that morning, were positioned differently than she remembered. Emma's homework papers, which had been stacked carefully on her desk, were in a slightly different order with different pages visible on top. Most disturbing, Jennifer found muddy footprints on the carpet near Emma's bedroom window. The prints were clearly defined in the light-colored carpet, showing the tread pattern of work boots or hiking boots. The prints were too large to belong to Emma and didn't match any shoes that Jennifer owned. The footprints suggested that someone had entered Emma's room through the window and walked around the room before leaving the same way. The mud was still damp, indicating that the intrusion had occurred recently, possibly while Jennifer was at work. Jennifer immediately called the police, who responded within 20 minutes and conducted a thorough investigation of the property. Officer Martinez, a veteran investigator with experience in residential break-ins, examined the house inside and outside, looking for evidence of how the intruder had gained access. The officers found no evidence of forced entry through doors or ground floor windows, but they discovered something that made Jennifer's blood run cold. Fresh footprints were clearly visible in the soft soil beneath Emma's bedroom window, and scuff marks on the exterior wall suggested that someone had used a ladder to reach the second-floor window. The footprints in the soil matched the pattern of the muddy prints found inside Emma's bedroom. The scuff marks on the wall were consistent with the metal edges of an extension ladder being placed against the house's siding. Officer Martinez examined Walter's property as part of the investigation and found a 12-foot aluminum extension ladder in Walter's garage. The ladder showed recent use, with soil on the rungs that visually matched the dirt beneath Emma's window. When questioned, Walter claimed he had been using the ladder to clean his gutters and perform routine maintenance on his house, but Officer Martinez noted that Walter's gutters were clean and showed no signs of recent maintenance. There were no leaves, debris, or other evidence that gutter cleaning had been performed recently. The soil on the ladder rungs appeared fresh and was similar in color and composition to the soil beneath Jennifer's house. Walter was questioned extensively about his activities on the evening of the break-in, but without direct evidence of illegal entry, the police couldn't make an arrest. Walter claimed he had been inside his house all evening, watching television and reading. He expressed surprise and concern about the break-in at Jennifer's house and offered to help with security monitoring in the future. The officers increased patrols in the Suburban neighborhood and advised Jennifer to install additional security measures. They recommended security cameras, improved lighting, and consideration of a more sophisticated alarm system that would detect window entry, as well as door access. Jennifer immediately had a professional security company install cameras around her property and upgrade her alarm system to include window sensors and motion detectors. She also changed all the locks on her doors and windows, even though there was no evidence that the intruder had possessed keys. Jennifer also purchased motion sensor lights for her backyard and installed additional lighting around the foundation of her house to eliminate dark areas where someone could approach without being seen. For several days after the security installation, the system remained quiet with no alerts or unusual activity detected. But the cameras revealed something that terrified Jennifer more than any break-in could. Have the extent of Walter's surveillance of her property and daily activities. The security cameras captured Walter spending hours each day watching Jennifer's house from his property. The footage showed him standing at his back fence for extended periods, using binoculars to observe Jennifer's windows and outdoor activities. When Jennifer and Emma were in their backyard, Walter would position himself where he could watch them while pretending to work in his garden or maintain his property. The cameras revealed that Walter's gardening and yard work activities were often synchronized with Jennifer's outdoor time. When she worked in her yard, Walter would appear in his garden. When Emma played outside, Walter would find reasons to be visible in his backyard. When Jennifer had phone conversations on her back porch, Walter would position himself close to the fence line where he could potentially overhear. Most disturbing, the cameras showed Walter's nighttime activities. After dark, he would walk the perimeter of his property closest to Jennifer's house, sometimes standing motionless for an hour or more, while watching her windows for signs of activity. Walter's surveillance routine was systematic and thorough. He monitored Jennifer's comings and goings, documented her work schedule patterns, and observed her social activities and domestic routines with the attention to detail of a professional investigator. Jennifer documented Walter's surveillance activities and reported them to the police, providing video evidence of his behaviors. But again, Walter wasn't technically breaking any laws by standing on his own property and looking toward her house. The surveillance was intrusive and disturbing, but it didn't meet the legal threshold for harassment or stalking charges. The situation escalated when Jennifer discovered that Walter had been going through her garbage. The security cameras captured him retrieving Jennifer's trash bags from her curb before the garbage truck arrived on collection day. Walter would take the bags to his garage, sort through the contents methodically, and return bags with certain items removed. Jennifer realized that Walter's detailed knowledge of her routines, Emma's activities, and their personal lives came from studying their discarded mail, receipts, school papers, medical documents, and other items that most people dispose of without thinking about the information they contain. Household garbage contains extensive personal information, bank statements, credit card bills, medical records, school documents, employment information, and social correspondence. By systematically collecting and analyzing Jennifer's trash, Walter could reconstruct detailed profiles of her financial situation, work schedule, personal relationships, and family activities. Jennifer consulted with a lawyer about obtaining a restraining order against Walter, but the attorney explained that proving harassment would require evidence of direct threats, unwanted contact, or behavior that caused reasonable fear for safety. Walter's surveillance, while disturbing and intrusive, was being conducted from his own property and didn't meet the legal standards for a restraining order. The attorney advised Jennifer to continue documenting Walter's behavior and to report any escalation or direct contact, but acknowledged that the legal system provided limited protection against surveillance and information gathering that stopped short of direct harassment or threats. Feeling trapped and violated by Walter's constant surveillance, Jennifer made the difficult decision to sell her house and move to a different neighborhood. The process took several months, during which Walter's surveillance continued and even intensified. As if he sensed that his opportunity to monitor Jennifer's life was going to end. During the final weeks before Jennifer's move, the situation took a frightening turn. Jennifer arrived home from work to find that someone had been inside her house again. This time, nothing was missing, but items throughout the house had been moved and rearranged in ways that suggested someone had conducted a thorough search of her personal belongings. Books had been rearranged on shelves with different volumes pulled forward. Kitchen utensils had been moved to different drawers. Clothing in Jennifer's closet had been sorted and reorganized in ways that didn't match her normal organization system. Most disturbing, Jennifer found a handwritten note on her kitchen counter that read, "You belong here. Don't leave. This is your home." The handwriting was neat and precise, suggesting education and careful attention to appearance. The message was presented as concern rather than threat, but the implication was clear. Someone believed they had the right to determine where Jennifer should live and was attempting to influence her decision to move. Jennifer called the police again, but the investigation found no evidence of forced entry. The security system showed no record of doors or windows being opened, suggesting that the intruder either possessed keys or had found another way to enter the house. The note couldn't be traced to Walter without handwriting analysis, which required voluntary cooperation that Walter refused to provide. Without additional evidence, the police couldn't pursue criminal charges, though they increased patrol frequency in Jennifer's neighborhood. Jennifer moved out the following weekend, staying in a hotel until she could close on a house in a different part of the city. On her last night in the house, Jennifer sat in her empty living room with all the lights on, knowing that Walter was watching from next door and feeling a mixture of relief and sadness about leaving the home she had hoped would provide security for her and Emma. Jennifer later learned from her realtor that Walter had attempted to purchase her house when it went on the market. When his offer was rejected in favor of a higher bid from another buyer, Walter had tried to convince the realtor to provide him with information about the new owner's background and family situation. The realtor reported that Walter had presented himself as a concerned neighbor who wanted to ensure that the new residents would be compatible with the neighborhood standards and would contribute positively to the community environment. The new family that moved into 412 Maple Street lasted 6 months before they also moved away, citing problems with a neighbor who couldn't respect boundaries. The house has been sold 3 times in the past 2 years, with each family experiencing surveillance and harassment that eventually forced them to relocate. Local police now maintain an active file on Walter Hensley and have increased routine patrols on Maple Street, but without evidence of criminal activity beyond property boundary violations, they cannot take action beyond enhanced surveillance and community awareness. Jennifer's experience taught her that home security involves more than locks and alarm systems. It requires awareness of the people who live close enough to observe your daily life and the recognition that some neighbors view proximity as permission to intrude into your private affairs. She now lives in different neighborhood with enhanced security measures and careful attention to privacy protection. But Jennifer still checks her locks multiple times before bed, still reviews her security camera footage regularly, and still remembers the feeling of being watched by someone who believed that paying attention to your life gave him the right to control it. The experience also taught Jennifer about the limitations of the legal system in protecting people from surveillance and psychological harassment that falls short of direct threats or physical violence. Sometimes the most invasive violations of privacy and safety occur in ways that are difficult to prosecute, but impossible to ignore. Story 2. The Helpful Neighbor. Michael Thompson had always prided himself on being self-sufficient. At 35, he owned his own construction business, maintained his property meticulously, and rarely needed help from anyone. So when he moved into the house at 1247 Oak Drive, he was surprised to find a neighbor who seemed determined to help whether Michael wanted assistance or not. Robert Chun lived in the house directly across the street, a well-maintained ranch-style home with a perfectly manicured lawn and garden. Robert appeared to be in his late 50s, retired from some professional job that had provided him with financial comfort and time to focus on home improvement projects. From Michael's first day in the neighborhood, Robert made himself available for any assistance Michael might need. Moving day is always stressful, Robert had said, appearing at Michael's front door with a cooler full of cold drinks. I thought you and your crew might appreciate some refreshments. Michael appreciated the gesture, though he found Robert's sudden appearance slightly intrusive. Michael hadn't mentioned to anyone in the neighborhood that he was moving in that day. Yet Robert seemed to know exactly when the moving truck would arrive. Over the following weeks, Robert continued to offer help with various projects around Michael's property. When Michael was installing a new mailbox, Robert appeared with tools and hardware. When Michael was working on his lawn, Robert offered the use of his riding mower. When Michael was painting his front door, Robert showed up with extra brushes and drop cloths. At first, Michael accepted Robert's help gratefully. Robert seemed knowledgeable about home maintenance and was clearly experienced with DIY projects. The assistance was genuinely useful, and Robert never asked for anything in return. But gradually, Michael began to notice aspects of Robert's helpfulness that made him uncomfortable. Robert always seemed to know when Michael was planning to work on projects around his house, even when Michael hadn't mentioned these plans to anyone. If Michael decided on Saturday morning to trim his hedges, Robert would appear within minutes with hedge trimmers and advice about proper pruning techniques. When Michael worked inside his house, Robert would find excuses to knock on the door and offer assistance. Robert claimed he could hear power tools or construction sounds and wanted to offer help. But Michael realized that Robert was monitoring his activities more closely than normal neighborly awareness would explain. Most concerning, Robert began to offer assistance with projects that Michael hadn't started and hadn't mentioned to anyone. Robert would appear at Michael's door with specific tools and materials for projects that Michael was only considering or planning. I noticed you were looking at your deck boards yesterday, Robert said one morning, arriving with wood stain and brushes. Thought you might be planning to refinish the deck this weekend. Michael hadn't been looking at his deck boards with any particular attention, and he hadn't made any decisions about deck maintenance. But Robert's assumption was correct. Michael had been thinking that the deck would need attention before winter. Michael began to suspect that Robert was spending considerable time observing his property and somehow anticipating his maintenance needs and home improvement plans. The situation became more intrusive when Robert began offering help with problems that Michael hadn't identified himself. Robert would point out issues with Michael's property: loose gutters, worn weather stripping, cracked driveway sections that Michael hadn't noticed, and suggest immediate solutions. I happen to notice that your back fence is starting to lean, Robert mentioned during one conversation. I have some fence posts and concrete mix if you want to fix it this weekend. Michael checked his back fence and found that it was indeed slightly loose, though the problem was barely noticeable and not urgent. Robert's observation was accurate, but it indicated that he was examining Michael's property with unusual attention to detail. Michael realized that Robert was conducting regular, thorough inspections of his property, not just casual observations from across the street, but detailed examinations of areas that wouldn't be visible from Robert's house. When Michael installed security cameras around his property to monitor a series of package thefts in the neighborhood, the cameras revealed the extent of Robert's surveillance activities. The footage showed Robert visiting Michael's property multiple times each week when Michael wasn't home. Robert would walk around the entire perimeter of the house, examining the foundation, windows, roof, and yard. He would take notes in a small notebook and sometimes take photographs of specific areas. Most disturbing, the cameras captured Robert testing doors and windows to see if they were locked. Robert would try each entrance to Michael's house methodically, apparently checking the security of the property. When confronted with the camera evidence, Robert seemed genuinely surprised that Michael was upset. I was just checking to make sure everything was secure while you were at work, Robert explained. I noticed your back door wasn't completely closed yesterday. and I wanted to make sure no one could break in. Robert's explanation was technically plausible. He claimed he was providing unofficial security monitoring while Michael was away. But Michael felt that Robert had violated his privacy and property boundaries without permission. Michael asked Robert to stop coming onto his property without invitation. But Robert seemed to interpret this as ingratitude rather than a reasonable boundary. "I'm just trying to be a good neighbor," Robert said. "But if you prefer to handle everything yourself, I understand." Robert's helpfulness ceased abruptly, but his surveillance continued. The security cameras showed Robert continuing to observe Michael's property from the street, taking notes and photographs, but no longer approaching the house directly. Michael hoped that establishing clear boundaries would resolve the situation. But Robert's behavior evolved in a more concerning direction. Michael began receiving anonymous notes in his mailbox, pointing out maintenance issues around his property. The notes were written in neat, precise handwriting and contained detailed observations about problems that would require immediate attention. "The caulking around your bathroom window is deteriorating and will allow water damage if not repaired promptly. Your driveway has a crack near the garage that will expand during winter freeze-thaw cycles unless sealed immediately. The weather stripping on your front door is worn and reduces energy efficiency significantly." All of the observations in the anonymous notes were accurate, but they described problems that would only be noticed through close inspection of Michael's property. Michael suspected that Robert was continuing his surveillance activities, but communicating through anonymous notes rather than direct contact. The notes escalated from maintenance advice to safety warnings. "Your electrical meter shows signs of corrosion that could create fire hazard. Your chimney cap is loose and could fall during high winds. Your basement window lock is broken, creating security vulnerability." Michael investigated each warning and found that they were all correct. The problems were real and potentially serious, but they were also problems that Robert couldn't have identified without accessing parts of Michael's property that weren't visible from the street. Michael realized that Robert was continuing to conduct detailed inspections of his property despite being asked to stop. The anonymous notes were Robert's way of demonstrating his continued vigilance while avoiding direct confrontation. Michael contacted local police, but the officers explained that providing accurate maintenance advice, even when unsolicited, didn't constitute harassment or trespassing unless Michael could prove that Robert was entering his property illegally. Situation reached a crisis when Michael discovered that Robert had been inside his house. Michael returned from a business trip to find that several maintenance problems mentioned in recent anonymous notes had been repaired. The bathroom window had been recaulked, the driveway crack had been sealed, and new weather stripping had been installed on the front door. All of the work had been done professionally, with high-quality materials and expert technique. But Michael had not authorized any repairs, and he had not given anyone access to his property. Michael's security cameras had been disabled during his absence, not damaged, but carefully disconnected in a way that suggested technical knowledge rather than vandalism. When Michael confronted Robert about the unauthorized repairs, Robert seemed genuinely confused by Michael's anger. "I thought you'd be grateful," Robert said. "You were obviously too busy to handle the maintenance yourself, and I had the time and skills to help. I used my own material, so there's no cost to you." Robert revealed that he had obtained a spare key to Michael's house from the previous owner, who had given it to Robert for emergency access. Robert claimed he had forgotten to mention the key to Michael and had used it to perform helpful maintenance while Michael was traveling. Michael demanded that Robert return the key and never enter his property again. Robert complied, but he seemed hurt and confused by Michael's rejection of his assistance. Michael had all the locks on his house changed and installed a more sophisticated security system. But he remained uncomfortable knowing that Robert continued to live across the street, continuing to observe, and possibly continuing to believe that being a helpful neighbor justified any level of intrusion. Michael eventually moved to a different neighborhood, unable to feel secure in his home, knowing that Robert maintained such detailed surveillance of his activities and property. The experience taught Michael that helpfulness can become a form of control, that surveillance can be disguised as security, and that some neighbors believe that proximity gives them rights and responsibilities that override personal boundaries and privacy. Story 3. The Perfect Family. Sarah Mitchell had always envied the Hendersons. Tom and Linda Henderson lived in the house directly behind Sarah's property, separated only by a shared fence line. They seemed to have everything Sarah wished for in her own life: a strong marriage, well-behaved children, financial stability, and a home that looked like it belonged in a lifestyle magazine. Sarah's own life felt chaotic in comparison. As a single mother working 2 part-time jobs, she struggled to maintain her small house and provide for her twin daughters. Her yard was overgrown, her car was unreliable, and she rarely had time for the home improvement projects that seemed to come naturally to families like the Hendersons. The Henderson family consisted of Tom, who worked as a financial advisor, Linda, who managed the household and volunteered with various community organizations, and their 2 children, Jessica, age 15, and Mark, age 12. They owned a beautiful 2-story house with a meticulously maintained yard, a swimming pool, and outdoor entertaining areas that hosted frequent neighborhood gatherings. Sarah often watched the Henderson family from her back window, admiring their apparent harmony and success. Tom and Linda seemed to have the kind of marriage that Sarah had hoped for before her divorce. Their children were polite, academically successful, and involved in multiple extracurricular activities. The family took expensive vacations, drove new cars, and seemed to navigate life without the financial stress that dominated Sarah's daily existence. What Sarah didn't realize was that the Hendersons were watching her with equal intensity, but for very different reasons. The first indication that something was wrong came when Sarah's daughters, Emma and Sophie, began reporting strange interactions with the Henderson children during neighborhood play. Jessica told us that her family has been keeping track of all the times you leave for work. Emma mentioned one evening, "She knows what time you go to the grocery store and when you do laundry." Sarah initially dismissed this as childish gossip, but when Sophie reported similar conversations with Mark Henderson, Sarah began to pay closer attention to her interactions with the Henderson family. Sarah realized that Linda Henderson seemed to know details about Sarah's life that shouldn't have been available. Through casual neighborly observation, Linda would make comments about Sarah's work schedule, her financial struggles, and her personal relationships with an accuracy that suggested deliberate surveillance. "I noticed you've been working extra shifts at the restaurant," Linda mentioned during one conversation. "That must be difficult with the girls' school schedules." Sarah hadn't mentioned her work schedule to Linda, and her restaurant job was at a location across town that wouldn't be visible from the Henderson property. Linda's knowledge suggested that she was actively gathering information about Sarah's employment and activities. Sarah also noticed that the Henderson family seemed to coordinate their outdoor activities with her own schedule. When Sarah worked in her yard, the Henderson family would appear in their backyard, ostensibly engaged in their own activities, but positioning themselves where they could observe, overhear Sarah's conversations with her daughters. When Sarah had friends visit or conducted phone conversations on her back porch, the Henderson family would find reasons to be outside, close enough to monitor what was being discussed. Most concerning, Sarah discovered that the Henderson children were asking Emma and Sophie detailed questions about their home life, financial situation, and Sarah's personal relationships. Mark wanted to know if you have a boyfriend and if he ever sleeps over, Sophie reported after one neighborhood play session. He also asked if we know how much money you make at your jobs. Sarah realized that the Henderson family was using her daughters as sources of information about her private life. The questions were being asked during casual play interactions, making them seem like innocent curiosity rather than systematic intelligence. Gathering. Sarah began to limit her daughter's interactions with the Henderson children and started paying closer attention to the family's behavior patterns. The surveillance became more obvious when Sarah noticed that the Hendersons were photographing her property. Sarah observed Linda taking pictures of Sarah's house, yard, and vehicles from various angles, apparently documenting the condition and appearance of Sarah's property over time. When Sarah confronted Linda about the photographs, Linda claimed she was documenting the neighborhood for a community improvement project. But Sarah noticed that Linda was only photographing her property, not other houses in the area. Sarah's concern escalated when she discovered that the Henderson family was discussing her personal life with other neighbors. Sarah learned that Linda had been sharing details about Sarah's financial problems, work schedules, and personal relationships with multiple families in the neighborhood. Linda Henderson told me you're having trouble making your mortgage payments, one neighbor mentioned during a casual conversation. She suggested that maybe the neighborhood association could help you with yard maintenance since you can't afford lawn service. Sarah was mortified to learn that her private financial struggles were being discussed among neighbors without her knowledge or consent. She had never discussed mortgage problems with Linda Henderson or anyone else in the neighborhood. Sarah realized that Linda was presenting herself as a concerned neighbor who was monitoring Sarah's situation out of helpfulness, but actually spreading private information that damaged Sarah's reputation and standing in the community. The situation became more sinister when Sarah discovered that the Henderson family was actively interfering in her attempts to improve her situation. Sarah had been working with a local business owner to clean offices on weekends for additional income. The arrangement was terminated abruptly when the business owner mentioned that he had received concerning information about Sarah's reliability and character from someone in her neighborhood. Sarah later learned that Linda Henderson had contacted her potential employer to share concerns about Sarah's ability to handle the additional work responsibilities. Linda claimed she was worried that Sarah was overextending herself and might not be able to fulfill her commitments reliably. Similar interference occurred when Sarah applied for a better position at a local medical office. During the interview process, the hiring manager mentioned that they had received a reference call from someone claiming to be Sarah's neighbor who raised questions about her stability as a single mother and her ability to maintain consistent work performance. Sarah realized that the Henderson family was actively sabotaging her attempts to improve her financial situation and career prospects. They were using their knowledge of her personal circumstances to present themselves as concerned neighbors while actually undermining her opportunities for advancement. The harassment escalated when Sarah began receiving anonymous letters pointing out her shortcomings as a neighbor and parent. Your yard maintenance affects the property values of the entire neighborhood. Please consider the impact your negligence has on your neighbor's investments. Single mothers should be especially careful about the example they set for their children regarding work ethic and personal responsibility. Community standards exist for the benefit of all residents. Please consider whether you are contributing positively to the neighborhood environment. The letters were typed and untraceable, but they referenced specific details about Sarah's property and lifestyle that indicated they were written by someone with intimate knowledge of her situation. Sarah suspected the Henderson family was behind the letters, but she couldn't prove their involvement. The situation reached a crisis when Emma and Sophie reported that Jessica Henderson had told them their family was planning to file complaints with county social services about Sarah's parenting. According to Jessica, the Henderson family had been documenting instances of neglect or irresponsibility that they believed made Sarah unfit to care for her children. Jessica claimed her parents had photographs of the girls playing unsupervised, records of times when Sarah worked late, and documentation of occasions when the family's meals or living conditions seemed inadequate. Sarah was terrified that the Henderson family's surveillance and documentation could be used to challenge her custody of her daughters or to involve government agencies in her family life. Sarah consulted with a lawyer who explained that much of the Henderson family's behavior, while unethical, didn't constitute actionable harassment unless she could prove deliberate interference with her employment or false reports to government agencies. Unable to continue living under constant surveillance and harassment, Sarah made the difficult decision to move to a different neighborhood. The financial strain of moving while already struggling economically was significant, but Sarah felt she had no choice. During her final week in the house, Sarah discovered the full extent of the Henderson family's monitoring activities. While packing belongings in her attic, Sarah found a small hidden camera that had been placed to record activities in her backyard. The camera was sophisticated and would have required deliberate installation by someone with access to her property. Sarah never learned how the camera had been installed, but its discovery confirmed that the Henderson family surveillance had extended beyond observation from their own property to actual electronic monitoring of her private life. Sarah's experience taught her that envy and judgment can motivate neighbors to conduct harassment campaigns disguised as community concern, and that families who appear perfect from the outside may be hiding competitive, controlling, and intrusive behaviors that target those they perceive as vulnerable or different. Story 4. The Night Visitor. David Kim worked the night shift as an emergency room technician, which meant he slept during the day and was often awake during the hours when most of his neighbors were sleeping. This schedule made him particularly aware of the nighttime activities in his quiet residential neighborhood, which is how he first noticed that something was wrong with the elderly man who lived next door. Harold Reeves lived alone in the house at 623 Pine Street, a modest 2-bedroom ranch that he had shared with his wife until her death 3 years earlier. Harold appeared to be in his 70s, retired, and generally kept to himself during the day. David's interactions with Harold had been limited but pleasant. Occasional waves when they encountered each other checking mail, brief conversations about lawn maintenance, and the kind of distant but cordial relationship that often exists between neighbors with different lifestyles and schedules. David's unusual work schedule meant that he was often arriving home at dawn or leaving for work near midnight, giving him opportunities to observe neighborhood activities that most residents never witnessed. It was during these transition hours, between night and day, that David began to notice Harold's strange behaviors. Harold was frequently outside his house during the late night and early morning hours, engaged in activities that seemed unusual for someone of his age and apparent physical condition. David would see Harold walking around his property at 2 a.m., working in his garden at 4 a.m., or standing motionless in his backyard for extended periods during the darkest hours of the night. Initially, David attributed Harold's nighttime activities to insomnia or the restlessness that sometimes affects elderly people. Many older adults experience sleep disturbances that lead to unusual activity patterns, and David assumed Harold was simply finding productive ways to occupy sleepless hours. But as David continued to observe Harold's nighttime routine, He realized that Harold wasn't engaged in normal yard work or property maintenance. Harold's activities seemed purposeless and repetitive, walking the same path through his yard multiple times, digging in his garden without planting anything, standing motionless while staring at neighboring houses. Most concerning, David noticed that Harold seemed to be focusing significant attention on the house directly across from his own property, where the Morrison family lived. The Morrisons were a young couple with 2 small children, and they maintained regular daytime schedules that meant their house was dark and quiet during Harold's nighttime activities. David observed Harold standing at the edge of his property, staring at the Morrison house for hours at a time. Harold would position himself behind trees or garden structures where he wouldn't be easily visible from the street, suggesting that he was deliberately concealing his surveillance activities. David began to document Harold's nighttime behavior, initially out of curiosity, but increasingly out of concern for the Morrison family's safety and privacy. Harold's activities followed consistent patterns. Between midnight and 4 a.m., he would walk the perimeter of his property multiple times, always ending up positioned where he could observe the Morrison house. He would stand motionless for extended periods, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, watching the dark windows and apparently monitoring for any signs of activity inside the house. During these surveillance sessions, Harold carried a notebook and pen, and David could see him making notations while watching the Morrison house. Harold appeared to be documenting the family's routines, recording times when lights went on or off, noting when cars arrived or departed, and tracking patterns of activity that would indicate the family's daily schedules. Most disturbing, David observed Harold testing the Morrison family security measures during his nighttime visits. Harold would walk along the property line between his yard and the Morrisons' backyard, examining their fence, checking gate latches, and observing their doors and windows from various angles. On several occasions, David saw Harold venture onto the Morrison property itself, walking through their backyard and examining their house closely. Harold would check whether doors were locked, test window security, and even peer through windows into the dark interior of the house. David realized that Harold was conducting detailed reconnaissance of the Morrison family's home security, daily routines, and vulnerability patterns. Harold's activities suggested planning and preparation for some kind of future action, rather than casual curiosity or harmless surveillance. David felt obligated to warn the Morrison family about Harold's activities, but he was uncertain how to approach the situation without seeming like he was engaged in surveillance himself. David decided to document Harold's activities with photographs and video before contacting the Morrison family. Using a camera with night vision capabilities, David captured extensive evidence of Harold's nighttime reconnaissance missions. Footage clearly showed Harold's systematic examination of the Morrison property, his prolonged surveillance of their house, and his testing of their security measures. The documentation provided compelling evidence that Harold was engaged in predatory behavior that posed a potential threat to the Morrison family's safety. When David approached Tom Morrison with the evidence, Tom was shocked to learn about Harold's activities. The Morrison family had no idea that their elderly neighbor was conducting nightly surveillance of their home and property. "We thought Harold was just a harmless old man," Tom said after reviewing David's documentation. "We never suspected he was watching our house or learning our routines." The Morrison family contacted local police, who investigated Harold's activities and discovered additional evidence of his surveillance and reconnaissance behavior. Police found that Harold had been maintaining detailed notebooks documenting the daily schedules, routines, and habits of multiple families in the neighborhood. Harold's documentation included floor plans of neighboring houses that he had apparently created through observation and possibly unauthorized entry. He had recorded the times when families left for work and school, when they returned home, when they typically went to bed, and when houses were left unoccupied. Most concerning, Harold had detailed plans for gaining entry to several neighborhood houses, including specific information about security vulnerabilities, spare key locations, and optimal timing for unauthorized access. Police investigation revealed that Harold had a history of voyeuristic behavior and property crimes in previous neighborhoods where he had lived. Harold had been forced to relocate several times due to complaints from neighbors about surveillance and harassment, but he had never been prosecuted for criminal charges. Harold's wife's death 3 years earlier had apparently removed the primary constraint on his inappropriate behavior, allowing him to escalate his surveillance and reconnaissance activities without concern for consequences. When confronted by police, Harold claimed that he was providing informal neighborhood security monitoring and that his documentation was intended to help protect his neighbors from potential criminals. Harold insisted that his activities were motivated by community spirit and concern for neighborhood safety. But police found evidence that Harold had been inside several neighborhood houses without permission, taking photographs and documenting the contents and layouts of family homes. Harold had apparently been using his reconnaissance information to conduct unauthorized entries when families were away. Harold was arrested on charges of trespassing, burglary, and stalking. Investigation of his house revealed extensive documentation of neighborhood families, hundreds of photographs taken without consent, and evidence suggesting that Harold had been planning more serious crimes against his neighbors. The Morrison family moved to a different neighborhood immediately, unwilling to continue living near Harold even after his arrest. Several other families in the neighborhood also relocated after learning about Harold's surveillance activities. David continued living in his house but installed extensive security measures and maintained heightened awareness of his surroundings. Harold's case taught David that elderly, seemingly harmless neighbors can pose serious threats, and that nighttime observation of neighborhood activities can reveal dangerous behaviors that are hidden from normal community awareness. Harold was convicted and sentenced to prison, but his case highlighted the vulnerability of suburban neighborhoods to predatory behavior from residents who use their proximity and apparent respectability to gain access to information and opportunities for criminal activity. Story 5. The family business. Maria Santos thought she had found the perfect neighborhood when she moved to Elm Street with her husband Carlos and their 3 young children. The suburban development was family-friendly, with well-maintained houses, safe streets for children to play, and neighbors who seemed to share similar values about community and family life. The house next door was owned by the Fletcher family, Jim and Karen Fletcher, and their teenage son Brandon. The Fletchers appeared to be a typical middle-class family who worked regular jobs and participated in neighborhood activities. Jim worked in sales for a medical equipment company. Karen was employed as an office manager for a local insurance agency, and Brandon attended the neighborhood high school. The Fletcher family seemed helpful and neighborly from the beginning. They offered assistance when Maria and Carlos were moving in, provided recommendations for local services like lawn care and home maintenance, and invited the Santos family to neighborhood gatherings and block parties. What Maria didn't realize was that the Fletcher family was evaluating her family's vulnerabilities and potential value for criminal exploitation. The first sign that something was wrong came when Maria noticed that packages and mail were occasionally missing from her front porch and mailbox. The missing items were never valuable enough to justify police reports. Promotional materials, small packages containing household items, utility bills, and other routine correspondence. Initially, Maria attributed the missing mail to delivery errors or neighborhood children playing pranks. But the pattern became more consistent and seemed to target specific types of mail that would contain personal information about the Santos family's financial situation, employment, and daily routines. Maria began to suspect theft when she realized that credit card statements, bank correspondence, and other financial documents were disappearing while promotional materials and obvious junk mail remained. Undisturbed. Maria started monitoring her mail delivery more closely and discovered that someone was systematically stealing mail in packages that contained personal or financial information, while leaving items that had no identity theft value. When Maria mentioned the mail theft problem to Karen Fletcher, Karen seemed unusually interested in the details of what had been stolen and when the thefts were occurring. "You should be more careful about when you put mail out for pickup," Karen advised. "Identity thieves look for personal information they can use to open credit accounts or access your financial information." Karen's advice seemed helpful, but Maria realized that Karen seemed to know more about identity theft techniques than a typical neighbor would learn. Through casual awareness of the problem, Maria became suspicious when Karen began asking detailed questions about the Santos family's financial situation, employment benefits, and personal business that seemed beyond normal neighborly interest. "Carlos mentioned he works for the city," Karen said during one conversation. "Those government jobs usually come with excellent benefits and retirement plans. You must feel very secure financially." Maria hadn't discussed Carlos's employment details with Karen, and Carlos worked for a private construction company, not the city government. Karen's assumption was incorrect, but it suggested that she was actively gathering information about the Santos family's income and financial status. Maria also noticed that Jim Fletcher seemed to know details about her daily routine that he shouldn't have been able to observe from his own property. "I saw you leave for work early yesterday morning," Jim mentioned. "Your new job must have different hours than your previous position." Maria hadn't changed jobs recently, and her work schedule had remained consistent for months. Jim's comment suggested that he was monitoring her activities more closely than normal neighborly awareness would explain. The situation escalated when Maria discovered that someone had been attempting to open credit accounts using her personal information. Credit monitoring alerts revealed multiple unauthorized inquiries and applications for credit cards, loans, and store accounts in Maria's name. Maria realized that the mail theft was being used to gather information for identity theft and financial fraud. Someone had obtained her social security number, employment information, and other personal details needed to apply for credit in her name. When Maria investigated the unauthorized credit applications, she discovered that the applications included accurate information about her employment, income, and personal details that wouldn't be available through stolen mail alone. The application suggested that someone had conducted extensive research into her family's financial situation and personal business. Maria began to suspect that the Fletcher family was involved in the identity theft, but she needed evidence to prove their involvement. Maria installed security cameras around her property to monitor mail delivery and observe any suspicious activity near her mailbox. The cameras captured Brandon Fletcher retrieving mail from the Santos family's mailbox on multiple occasions when the family wasn't home. The footage showed Brandon taking mail in packages, sorting through the items in his own yard, keeping documents that appeared to contain personal information, and discarding items that had no value for identity theft purposes. Additional investigation revealed that Brandon was also collecting mail from other houses in the neighborhood using the same systematic approach, targeting financial documents and personal correspondence while leaving promotional materials and obvious junk mail. Maria realized that the Fletcher family was operating a neighborhood-based identity theft operation, using their position as trusted neighbors to gain access to personal information from multiple families in the area. When Maria confronted the Fletcher family with the video evidence, they initially denied involvement and suggested that Brandon was collecting mail to help elderly neighbors who had difficulty reaching their mailboxes. But police investigation revealed the full extent of the Fletcher family's criminal operation. The family was running an organized identity theft and financial fraud scheme that targeted multiple neighborhoods across the city. Jim Fletcher used his sales job to gather information about potential victims through professional databases and customer lists. Karen Fletcher processed fraudulent credit applications and managed stolen financial information through her office management skills. Brandon Fletcher conducted physical surveillance and mail theft to gather the personal information needed for identity theft. Police investigation of the Fletcher house revealed extensive documentation of identity theft victims, stolen personal information from dozens of families, and evidence of financial fraud totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Fletcher family had been targeting neighborhoods with young families who were likely to have good credit ratings and stable income, but might not be monitoring their financial information closely enough to detect identity theft quickly. The family's criminal operation had been ongoing for several years, with the Fletchers relocating to different neighborhoods when their activities attracted attention or when they had exhausted the potential victims in their current area. Maria's neighborhood was the Fletcher family's most recent target area, but police investigation revealed that they had operated similar schemes in at least 4 previous neighborhoods, leaving behind victims who had suffered financial damage and credit problems that took years to resolve. The Fletcher family was arrested and charged with multiple counts of identity theft, mail theft, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Their conviction resulted in prison sentences for all 3 family members and restitution requirements for their victims. Maria's experience taught her that organized criminals often target neighborhoods by establishing themselves as trusted residents who use their community standing to gain access to personal information and opportunities for theft. The case highlighted the importance of protecting personal information, even from neighbors who appear trustworthy, and the need for vigilance about identity theft techniques that exploit community relationships and social trust. Maria and Carlos eventually moved to a different neighborhood, but they maintained heightened security measures and careful monitoring of their financial information based on their experience with neighbor-based identity theft.